I couldn't be more excited to welcome Academy Award-nominated documentarian Julie Cohen. Julie's revelationary body of work has helped the world discover divine truths. For example, one of my favorites is RBG, the documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or the Sturgeon Queens, American veteran Julia. And now, one of the most inspiring stories I have seen about building resilience is Gabby Gifford Won't Back Down. Julie, your work has inspired so much of my personal exploration and self-discovery. You have this innate ability to immortalize people's stories on film, bringing really special revelations to us all. So where does your story begin?
My story begins in the D.C. suburbs, Falls Church, Virginia. I guess my story begins in Washington, D.C., where I was born at George Washington University Hospital. But my childhood was in the Virginia suburbs, where I grew up with mom and dad and my brother. Went to the great Fairfax County Public Schools. I feel like I had the nice benefit of growing up in a community where I had a fairly, everyone kind of people knowing each other. I wasn't one of those families that moved around a lot, so I really knew my elementary school and then junior high school and high school friends classmates quite well, and that's kind of it. I mean, I have suburbs are very much on my mind because I've been a city girl for most of my adult life, but my husband and I moved to Bloomfield, New Jersey 2 weeks ago, so that feels like a somewhat of a return.
I hear you. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and San Antonio, outside of the downtown area, is very much like one big sprawling suburb. A part of that growing up, where was it that you found your love for filmmaking or even documentaries?
Yeah, I can't say I really that wasn't something that I developed in childhood. I certainly loved movies from the very start and was a big reader. And I think that there's more of a connection between books and documentaries than most people think. I actually like to start the making of every documentary by reading one really good related book, just to get some grounding in one subject matter, sometimes more than one, but I think reading is not kind of enough of a discussed part of the filmmaking process. Writing too. I think writing and filmmaking are so closely connected, and I certainly know some filmmakers who complain about all of the writing you have to do at the beginning of the process, like writing treatments, writing funding proposals. I actually find that part of the process extremely useful. The only way to gather your thoughts in a deep way is to write it down rather than, it's just a different kind of thinking than the off-the-cuff thinking that you do when you're pitching something verbally. So I always welcome the opportunity. And when I'm working with executives on a project, I often offer to write them up memos every, month or so, letting them know what progress we're making and what we've been filming, what we're working on with the structure and stuff, because I find it a really helpful way to organize my own thinking.
I love that, because I think you're absolutely right. It's not just a part of that research process, right? Is the reading piece of this, but I've always found that I often feel like my own writing is influenced and gets better the more I read. There is this interesting symbiotic thing that goes on, I think, in our brains that we don't really capture about that importance of the reading and then trying to relay that into something new or an idea. As a kid, so did you find that as a kid, as part of that reading, was it something kind of that came naturally to you, or what were the kinds of stories that you ended up really loving?
I loved all kinds of stories, but I'm an animal lover, so I did love some animal stories. Watership Down. I don't know if that's a book that modern day younger readers are going to be familiar with, but it's like a really interesting, intense book about like a warring warrens of rabbits. It was a book that like just completely entranced me as a kid. There's like action and adventure and romance, but it's all rabbits. There's actually a fair amount of violence in it. But it's just a really spectacular story, and one that I remember being really engrossed in as a kid. I also loved and read several times at different phases of my life, starting in sort of late childhood, 1984, the George Orwell future dystopia book. And I think there's something really important for storytellers in that book, because it's a book that you can connect with on all kinds of levels. I first read it when I was 12, even though it has sort of mature themes, but my family had this little thing we did where we had like a family book group. Like, this was before book groups were a thing, but when we would go on vacation, my parents would pick out books, and then my dad would read it, then my mom would read it, then my older brother, who was 2 years older than I, would read it, and then I would read it. And that was how I first read 1984. And when I read it as a kid, I was sort of following some very broad themes. It's kind of a romance story. I got that part. There's some like there's good guys and bad guys. I got that. Then I had to read it like as a senior in high school for a class, and sort of got some other themes. And then I read it again as an adult, and it's sort of like each time, like I didn't even notice the politics when I was reading it at age 12. But like later you get into that. And I think that's, I think actually the best films and documentaries should be like that. They should work on all kinds of levels. A lot of people, we were my directing partner on some of these films, including RBG and Gabby Giffords of the ones you mentioned. Betsy West, like we had not intended our RBG film about Justice Ginsburg to be a children's documentary, but it ended up that like a lot of kids were going to it, like, and really enjoying it, particularly little girls. It just, and we were like, wow, we didn't really set out to make a children's documentary, but we were so pleased that children found something to connect with in this character in some like very deep way that was probably not so much about the sort of, legal constitutional issues that the film touched on. It had more to do with the love story. It had more to do with this, like, we kind of felt like the littleness of our character had something to, this very tiny person who in a quiet way was very tough and strong. And like a lot of kids seem to really relate to that.
I totally agree with you. I think I remember sitting actually all of the family down to see it when it came out. That's the kind of family we are. We would, just sit down and say, what is it that this person gets, or this person's life gets to teach us? And I remember walking away from it. It didn't matter. We have 4 children, and there wasn't one of them that didn't have something unique taking away from it. And you're absolutely right. So much of your work does that. Where do you think you began to hone that craft of being able to tell people's stories in this multi-dimensional way?
Yeah, well, in my case, I mean, first of all, I appreciate the word craft, because I do feel like that's what I am in the deepest way, as like a craftsperson. And it's not like you just have this gush of inspiration and then everything just magically happens. Like, the project of any big, like, quote unquote artistic endeavor is really a craft practice. It's really just a matter of a lot of hard work and a lot of shaping and reshaping and a lot of trying something one way, and if that doesn't work, trying it another way. It's not like, oh, you just sit back until, lightning strikes and then it all comes together. So, but in my case, I really honed the craft in a pretty, one path for a lot of people into documentary film is journalism. And I was a broadcast journalist for a long time. I did some print, I did radio, I did television. I worked at NBC for a long time. I was a producer and writer there. So, I was put in a very good position to have to create a lot of stories and write a lot of stories very rapidly, because that's what you have to do in the TV business. And it actually helped it helped break some of the habits where you get sort of stuck. Like if something is going to be on television next week, you can't really get stuck.
Right.
You have to move forward. And I actually often find that the product that you would create in 2 weeks, if you have 2 weeks, is probably the same is maybe close to the product you would create in 8 weeks if you have that amount of time. So it was actually very helpful to me to have a background professionally where I was forced to think and write and structure stories very quickly, and then that kind of opened the door to doing things where there's a little more time to work on it.
Gotcha. In doing some of my research for today's conversation, I noticed you also worked at Court TV. And I began to thinking, like, do I see this thread on that legal piece here? Because I also noticed that you have a master's, am I correct, in law?
Yes. Yeah. So those things are all connected, certainly, and are connected to some of the work that I've done more recently. My dad is a lawyer, and was one of those lawyers who actually really enjoys the law. Like he represented labor unions and had lots of really interesting cases, did a lot of kind of appellate law stuff. And unlike, it wasn't until I was already a grown up that I started to understand that a lot of lawyers really dislike their jobs, because my dad seemed to love being a lawyer and definitely always talked about it very positively. So I had, positive associations with the law. In my early journalistic career, I found that I really enjoyed covering trials. I was a news reporter for a radio station for 3 years in New York, and that job entails, like, basically every morning you're getting assigned something different. It's like stuff's going on in the city. They're like, "Are you do this, do that?" You get assigned to different things. And I really found that my favorite stories were covering criminal trials at that point. There were this was like in the early 1990s, and there were some very high profile trials. There was a racially motivated murder that led to a case that was widely known as the Bensonhurst case, a very tragic story of a Black teenager who had gone into a white neighborhood to to buy a used car that had been advertised in a classified ad. Just like a completely random situation. Like he went to buy a car. He shows up in this neighborhood, and a group of white guys who are mistaking him for someone else who was dating somebody's girlfriend or whatever, very, brutally, killed him. That led to an extremely contentious, not just a trial, but a set of trials, because a number of this white gang who had committed the crime, were tried separately. So there were a number of trials. I was a radio reporter covering that, and I found it very interesting. It was kind of a little bit more interesting than some of the other stories that you're sort of thrown in for a day. You don't really understand it. I was like, that these trials were lasting 3 or 4 weeks. And when you went every day and listened to all the testimony or doing reports, I felt like you could sort of get a little bit of a deeper sense of things. And I just really, I really found, criminal law just a pretty interesting subject for journalistic coverage. And that's what led me when the network that later became Court TV, that much later became something else called True TV. But when Court TV started up in the early 90s, I actually wrote to the head of it saying, like, "Oh, I hear you're starting this network about trials. Like, I love trials. Like, I love covering, I've been a journalist. I love covering trials. Like, can I come work for you?" And it was a startup, so they had some positions for junior level people, and I got a junior level job there and kind of worked my way up to being a producer there, and ultimately starting a show that they did about the Supreme Court. So, and then that led me to the law school program that I did wasn't for people who wanted to be lawyers. It was for journalists who wanted a real background in the law. So I went and I left Court TV thinking that, like, if I'm going to try to market myself as a journalist who has a specialty in law, I should maybe get some formal education. And I went and did this year-long master's program. And then I went right from there to NBC, where they were, in fact, expanding their coverage of criminal trials.
Wow, that's a pretty amazing transition. And it's also kind of a scary thing to leave what feels like a budding career at a startup, to, to go back to being a student. And what did you see in some of the risks, or was it just natural? It's like, wait, if I really want to do this and I want to do it well, I better go sharpen this muscle I have between my ears.
Yeah. The program that I went to was a very specific program for people in my position. It wasn't like wow, that's weird to go to law school. It was like, we have this program for people that are already journalists that want some background in the law. There was a foundation that funded it. So it wasn't like I didn't need to pay the very expensive, law school fees. It was just a year through this program. And I thought I would probably come out of it in a better situation than just having had my job at Court TV. So I didn't think that much about the risk when I was doing it. I loved doing it. It was really fun to go back to school as a 32-year-old. I feel like I got more out of that year of school than any other schooling I did, because I was kind of more ready to I was really there to learn. It was just a little different than my previous, academic experiences. So I liked that a lot. But truthfully, like you say, what were the risks? And I was like, there's no risk. But truthfully, then when I got out, it did take me about 4 or 5 months to get it. It's not like I actually didn't even get a job. What I got at NBC initially was some freelance assignments, which ultimately worked their way into a job. So it did turn out to be risky, but I was not thinking about that. I was not thinking too heavily about that, at the time.
Gotcha. We talked a little bit about really your college formative years. What took you, what was the thing that went, gosh, journalism and writing is potentially a path? Like, what was it that inspired you to take that path amongst all the paths that were available to us? I mean, you and I feel like we might be of the same age genre. And so I would say that if we were to think about it, our moms probably had lesser opportunity to select from an array of career paths, right? And I often think about it, it's like, wow, we could have been anything.
Yes. Yeah. Right? So absolutely. My mom certainly was in the generation where women's career paths were really constrained, and in fact, my mom, when she came out of college, had an internship at the labor department, and then when she married my dad, and that was all going great. And then when she got pregnant with my brother, it was like, okay, that's, that's it. Like, okay, that's basically the end of your career. Like, everyone understood that. And while I don't think she minded that hugely at the time, because it was so accepted, and she wasn't going into motherhood in a resentful way. She really particularly seemed to enjoy having little kids, but ultimately I think it really made her angry. Now, interestingly, she became an artist when although she hadn't had any artistic training at all, when she was pregnant with my brother, she started art as a hobby. She got more and more into it, and she became an artist, professionally. But that said, later in life, she would talk about how her father, who had been a lawyer, had told her that she would be a really good lawyer. And she wouldn't have said it this way. She's passed away now, so I'm speaking of her. She wouldn't have said it this way, but I think she really resented the lack of opportunities for women. And I will say that she had a very strong sense of the possibilities for me being different and wanting me to explore that. And one good example of that. So when I was in high school, one elective course you could take was typing. And I wanted to take typing because I thought it'd be useful for at that time, you had to type all your papers and whatever. It was before laptops, right. But they're old typewriters, young people. Yep. Let us explain it to you.
I believe IBM Selectric was what I got to learn on.
Exactly. So, my mother vetoed my taking typing in high school. She said, no, if you, like, I don't want you to be a secretary, like, you shouldn't learn to type. Now, actually, this was a little ridiculous because there's all kinds of reasons to be, like, while I didn't work as a secretary, nor did I have a secretary, so actually I do need to type. And, in a period before I went to a graduate program in journalism soon after college. And there was actually a requirement that you type 40 words a minute, and I didn't know how to type to get in. So I actually took a summer class at a secretarial school to learn to, because I'm like, okay, I guess I need to type. And I like typing anyway, but like my mom really did, want me to be a professional person.
Gotcha. And so, in terms of that exploration of kind of that early, what helped you? I always think about this is that often in those years that you're going into college, that you don't necessarily have an idea. You may have a dream, but maybe not necessarily understand the path that might be in front of you.
Yeah, I didn't have a clue, I would say. And in terms of getting into journalism, well, first of all, I'll say that my paternal grandfather, my dad's father, was a newspaper reporter. He was a sports writer for the New York Post. And that was always presented to us as having been like a pretty cool career. Like, he didn't make a lot of money, but he knew the New York Giants, and he had like great Knicks tickets, and he had we got Billie Jean King's autograph. Like it was sort of and going to sports events with him in the press box was like incredible. It's like what, and he was what you might think a New York Post sports reporter in the 1960s and 70s might have been. He wore a little hat. He smoked a cigar. He was like a really fun, kind of salty, old, lovely Jewish man. I don't know. He really was sort of a character. So I had that view of journalism. But really not much else. And, I was at a point in my life where I thought maybe I should go to graduate school in something. And really the impetus for going to journalism school was how much I wanted to move to New York. And I went to Columbia, which is in New York. I just was like, oh, I should go to New York. I can't say that these things were like deeply, deeply thought out. But I will say that from the very first week of journalism school, I was like, oh, this is amazing. It's a fantastic, what a interesting, things have changed a lot, and journalism, that the journalism that exists now is not what it was in 1989 when I was studying journalism. But part of the program that I was in was you were going out there and writing stories, and you got a little press pass. And, within my first week, I was sent down to City Hall to cover a story. And, the mayor at that time, who was Ed Koch at that time, was giving a press conference. And I had my little, as a student at Columbia, you had a little press pass, and I raised my hand and I asked him a question, and he answered it. And I was like, this is the coolest thing in the world. Here I am, I'm this young, tiny person, and you're telling me I could just go to City Hall and ask the mayor a question just because I have a press pass? This is the coolest job in the world.
Most powerful positions to be able to ask that question. That's fantastic. In that journey of kind of taking you through there, what were some of the things that you learned? I mean, obviously, I think there's always the academic version of school, but to that point around the actual practice of what it means to be a journalist. Because I think there's, to your point around the craft of writing, right, and the craft of filmmaking is one aspect, but I also think that there's a practice that makes you a better questioner, a better interviewer. What were some of those things that you did that helped hone that?
Yeah, I think a big part of it was listening, having a conversation that involves listening, not so much having a charted out list of everything that I wanted to ask, but more just listening to what the person was saying and going from that. And even more today as a documentary filmmaker, when a lot of what you're doing is spending time filming and watching people and trying to not be so nervous about like all the things that can go wrong with your filming, and is the, is the cinematographer like in the right position? They can be worrying about all these different elements that take you out of the present moment. But if you're like watching very carefully what your subjects are doing, you'll learn all kinds of things about them, which will lead to interesting questions and ways to engage. So, I do think that some of the things that make someone a good documentary filmmaker would be like the same qualities that might make you a good friend, like trying to pay attention to someone else and listen to what they have to say, and try to set yourself aside for long enough to look at what their experience might be and get into their mind a little bit, and then try to come at it from that perspective.
I love that, because I think that so often, I often think that so many of us come into that space, sometimes even in journalism, with maybe a predisposition of what the outcome should be, as opposed to enabling the story to go where it really is supposed to go.
Right.
Because often when you are so occupied with a point of view, you tend to miss those little nuggets that make people incredibly human, or humanize the story or the subject matter. And I think that's such an important part of, I think, your work today, is that it's so clear to me that one of the gifts you bring to the table is active listening. It isn't passive at all. It's actually looking for those nuggets.
Yeah. And I think a big part of that is trying to get out of one's own nervousness. Like there's kind of a lot to be nervous about when you're making a film, and you can get so caught up in everything that could be going wrong that makes you not pay attention to what's actually happening. And learning to set aside like all those anxieties that people have when they're doing what I do and what a lot of jobs entail. Like a lot of it is just like, I've worked as a teacher advising people making documentaries also. And I really think so much of the process is just the psychology of it all, like getting so worried about it going wrong that you don't notice that you're not listening to what's happening. Or, in the case of our work, there's so much that you're filming, and people, if you're worried that it didn't come out, that what you're filming wasn't exactly what you were trying to get, then people become like afraid of their own footage. And actually delving in and looking at the footage that's been shot as soon as possible is like really key, because until you're seeing, until you're forgetting the expectation of what you promised whoever was funding the film, what it's going to be, don't worry about that. Like the more key is like, what am I getting? And like what you're getting often is really good, and you can build a lot out of it.
Well, it's beautiful. I think those are words of wisdom that I think everybody who's exploring this space, so often you get wrapped up in the minutia, and as opposed to just enabling the story to reveal itself.
Right. And just learning that, the first attempt at something is really just the beginning of the process. And you can get, I had a student once, actually a very talented young woman, who showed me a rough cut of something, of a piece that she had created, and just said with a really deep despondency, like, it's just not what I imagined in my head that it was going to be. Like I had this idea, like, it's just not what I imagined it was going to be. And I said, Poppy, her name was Poppy, I have felt that way every rough cut of every film I've ever done. And I've been doing this for 25 years. So don't worry. Like that feeling is actually good. That's the feeling that's going to propel you to now make it better.
Yeah. That's the rough part.
Correct. Exactly. That's why they call it a rough.
It's too bad. I always look at it this way. It's really too bad that we don't dream in rough cuts, because it would make sometimes the process so much easier. I guess that's one way of lowering the bar if you started dreaming in rough cuts.
Right.
STEAM skills equip women and girls to participate in the global workforce. Yet in 2021, only 27% of scientists, technologists, engineers, artists, mathematicians, and designers were women. This is why DesignByUs.org is committed to closing the gender and pay gap, enabling 10 million women and girls to take command of the command line and change the world for good. Last year, your donations helped the Design Corps fight climate change, COVID-19, and disinformation on the web. Your donations and investment help us meet this goal. I'm asking you to visit designbyus.org/donate. That's DESIGNEDBYUS.org/DONATE and make a donation today.
Hi, I'm Maddie Kramer, the host of The Last Generation, a podcast about profound conversations between Holocaust survivors and their grandkids. As the grandkid of a Holocaust survivor, I never got the chance to have that conversation, so I wanted to encourage others to do so. This new season is available on all platforms.
Listeners, be sure to check out Julie Cohen's latest documentary, Gabby Gifford Won't Back Down. It's streaming right now on Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV, Redbox, and Roku.
Did you feel like it was a natural kind of transition from the world of journalism, telling often 30-second stories, 2-minute stories, to long form stories?
Well, you know what? I was actually in the long form journalism. I mean, I did some shorter stories when I was in public radio, but when I was at NBC, I was working for Dateline. So I was doing mostly hour and 2-hour stories. It's just that they were about murder trials, not the more. And I will say, I actually don't think it's a coincidence that since then in my documentary independent work, I've gravitated towards like much more positive subject matter. Like I like, trying to.
The 90s were rough.
The
90s were rough.
Yeah, I really prefer like, and not that I mind what, I think there can be some very, tough material that can make quite a good story, but that's for the most part, I want to tell stories that have a lot of love in them.
Well, you're definitely doing that now. I just say that I took an opportunity to go and explore something as simple, and it's not simple, it is so rich. The Sturgeon of Queens, right? That actually, I have to tell you, I had just like there was just speaking of love, so much love in the craft of not just the story of this family that I believe 4 generations in this family, Russ and daughters, but also like these nuggets, the things that I loved that you were able to kind of tease out was what made them different. The dad being an early feminist to, really this being almost very much a woman-owned and woman-run business that, I think tactically you could say, oh, you know what, you get your bagels and your lox and they're a really wonderful deli. But in reality, when you walk in, and what the story revealed was that it was like these little blessings, these little like love notes to every one of their customers. How is it that you go about picking your subjects or your subject matter?
Yeah, I mean, often there's just a threshold question of is this a story you want to spend a number of months or years kind of delving into. And beyond that, it can kind of go in all different directions. It helps if the story is like not just one note, if there's like a different layer to it. I mean, the Sturgeon Queens, as you mentioned, has like these, 4, it's these generations of a Jewish family, but then there was this incredibly interesting twist. The story starts in 1914, but then in the 70s, there's the twist of some Dominican immigrants to New York moving, a new generation of immigrants moves to town, starts working at the store. One employee in particular, Herman Vargas, who's a major character in the story, ends up learning not only to slice lox, but also to speak Yiddish because he understood that would connect him to the customers in a way that was going to be helpful for his career. And his family's immigrant story in the 70s is so similar to Joel Russ's immigrant story from the early 1900s. And it just sort of reminds us what brings us all together and is just kind of unexpected. I also kind of loved, some of the conflict within the family, a lot of the arguing is all good. And
Julie, that one of most of your work, that one I have to say felt so familiar to me. And I don't know, it was the Jewish thing, or it was like, for us, we are Latinx Jews. So for us, our language is Spanish. But I will tell you from that, it was like, oh, wait a minute. The things that we talk about in Spanish, this is the Yiddish word for that. And I had those connections between it. And it was just, I don't know, it felt like such a gift to feel like you got to know the family so well.
Yeah. Yes. Well, in some ways, I feel like that was different than some projects that I've done, because I often feel like I'm delving into worlds that are very new to me. And whereas the Russ family, I felt like, no, this is something like herring. Like, these are subjects I'm very familiar with. And definitely felt a connection, to them. So, but also I was actually surprised how many fans that film ended up getting who weren't Jewish. Like, I didn't really expect that, but I certainly ran into a lot of people who said that the two sort of grandmotherly characters, the sisters who are at the heart of the story, reminded them of people in their own family. And I very much in my documentary life gravitated towards older characters. I love interviewing people in their 80s and 90s. I think they're better interview subjects than younger people. It was an opportunity that I didn't have when when you work in network news, they're always trying to appeal to the key demographic, which is 18 to 49. And the belief is that people in that demographic don't want, once anyone turns 50, nobody wants to hear from them anymore. My first project in my independent documentary world was something I was commissioned to do for New York Public Television, which was called New York Goes to War. It was about New Yorkers who served in World War II and New Yorkers who kind of served at home, like Rosie the Riveter type people, like what New York was like during World War II. And so for that project, by definition, I was interviewing people who were in their 80s and 90s. And it was just such a revelation, because they were so, first of all, people are pretty honest by that age, just more honest than younger characters. But I also think the difference wasn't just age. It was also kind of generational, because that was kind of the last opportunity to be interviewing people who didn't grow up with television. And as a result, one thing I always found interestingly when I was working for Dateline is people that are in a Dateline story all end up talking like people that are on a Dateline story, because they've all seen Dateline. Even the people who are the murderers, you go to prison and you start interviewing them and they start sounding like every other, they kind of know the conventions of the story, and they'll be like, oh, we had such a fairy tale wedding. It's all kind of odd. Whereas the older people are just tended to do interviews in a much more individualistic way, and they might say anything. So it just, now on the other flip side of that is the connection between my question and their answer was often not so tight. People would not that I was talking to people who were totally cogent, but they were going to say what they were going to say. They'd so the more the trick was to not get in their way, to let them say what they wanted to, and to coax out more when something seemed really fruitful. And as you've seen in a bunch of the films that I've worked on solo and a bunch of the films that I've worked on with Betsy, we really enjoy interviewing people in pairs, because just seeing the relationships between people is so interesting. And when you put two people together in front of a camera, especially if they've known each other for a long time, you often get something magical happens that's very different from interviewing individuals.
I love that, because I think that one of the things you capture, and I think you've captured it in RBG, the Sturgeon Queens, and even in the way that people talked about Julia Childs, was there's the beauty of hindsight and wisdom. And you just don't have that. I'm nearing my 50s, and I don't think I have enough of it. Julie. There's like times when I'm like, I can reflect back on them, but I would imagine, I know when speaking with my mom, who is in her 70s, there's a lot of hindsight and wisdom. And I think a part of it is that you also become a little bit more comfortable in yourself, and that filter, I guess maybe this generation's filter might be the Twitter filter, or even the TikTok filter.
Right.
At some point has to come off.
Right.
I think there is something to that. So in this world of telling long form stories, what has been the thing that you're most proud of?
Well, that's kind of hard to say. I mean, almost, sometimes it's not even the product so much as the connections with the human beings that are in the stories. I mean, our current film about Gabby Giffords, the member of Congress who was shot in the brain and had to work her way back from a coma to a fully functioning, incredibly engaging and charismatic and tough activist that she is today. Like, getting to know her has been amazing. Like, she's just the most incredible person I think I've ever met. And I think that, from what we know from people who've known her for much longer than we have, she was a really intense and charismatic person before she was shot as well. But she's just like, it's just like, so like, I don't even know how to exactly describe it, but it's like, I think we're really proud of the film, but I'm also really proud to be friends with this incredible person.
Well, if I had to hone in on it, I think one of the things first of all, I have not seen the Gabby film yet. I am so excited to go and see it. I think we're talking about it's in theaters now. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. I remember exactly where I was on January 8th when that news flash came across. And something about Gabby is someone who I wouldn't say that I, overtly political, but there was something about her and her, I would say almost her rise to celebrity was something that there was something special about her and her desire for public service. It wasn't as if she was going in and she was in the form of politics. I think that she was giving definition and rise to the public service aspect of it. So I remember standing in my living room, on January 8th, and our kids were out, and it was kind of our typical, I want to say it was a weekend, if I remember correctly. And I remember that news flash coming on. It was just, it felt like a shot that was aimed at hope. Because my takeaway from, who she is through her acts, and her beliefs and why she went into public service was one of giving hope that the world could get better incrementally.
Yeah.
And there's something that we said that I think in those nuggets of your film, you bring these people that are larger than life often, that have these remarkable stories tell, but you bring them into our living rooms or into the theater in such a way that that friendship that you've created with them, because I felt that way with your Ruth Bader Ginsburg work, was that we felt like we knew them.
Yeah, well, I think, trying to create that personal tone is certainly part of what we've been doing with these films. It's in some ways, I mean, that's why I talk about my journalistic training being so much a part of my filmmaking, and it is, but that's a part that's kind of new that I will say, when I first watched a cut of the film that we had created about the New Yorkers who served in World War II, we had been working on it in these little tiny chunks, myself and the editor, and we hadn't really been watching large stretches of it. And it was a 2-hour film, and at one point we sat down and watched everything that we had at a certain point, and I just looked at it and I was like, wow, what I said to the editor, a great guy named Kerry Holloway, said, wow, it's so loving. And because that wasn't what I've been doing at NBC. And I'm I just felt I did love these amazing, like, 92-year-old veterans. Like what was it? Like, I hadn't really set out to make that the center of the film, but when you watched it, I mean, one thing that we did in that film, and actually comes up in the Gabby Giffords film too, is like, letting characters sing. And for these veterans that I was having recall what was sometimes really painful parts of their lives, because one of them had been a prisoner of war and one had been shot kind of severely, but yet they also had really fond memories of their service in the way that, veterans of that war in particular do. They were proud of the role they had played in stopping something horrible, as they should be. And part of the process of them recalling was like, I just have them sing songs to the camera of like that they loved, and they have these beautiful voices and they're singing, and I just felt like, like, wow, I like that you can sort of feel that there's some love there. When you're training to be a journalist, they don't really tell you should try to create work that's loving, but like, I'm like, that's kind of how I want things to be going forward. Like, you go through life, and like, there's all kinds of phases to it, but like, I'm also, the characters were older at a time that I was sort of getting heavily into middle age and thinking about that. This was also at the early stages of filming in high definition, where you were not even 4K yet, although now we film in 4K.
Right.
But for the first time we had gone from standard definition to high definition, and there had been a fear, particularly in the broadcast news world, but all throughout the industry of people that make real visual stuff of real people. There had been this fear, high definition is going to be terrible because everybody's going to look terrible. Like, if you're not 23, you're going to look like crap. You're going to see the lines. You're going to see, and that World War II piece was the first thing I'd done in high def. And it was like the opposite. You saw the people's wrinkles, but they were beautiful. Like, you just saw like the real beauty of the people. Like, and, just sort of allowing that to come through seems like a really worthy thing.
It's interesting how each one of those lines, we say wrinkles, but right, each one of those lines probably has a story behind it altogether. And I think that's a really interesting insight into, all the things that we tend to fight, the age-defying things that we tend to fight. Right. That we're often fighting the storytelling, or even the wisdom that comes with what it means to have lived that long.
Yes, right. No, it really, it really changed my own view of aging to like have that experience. And I was like, oh no, I was like, well, although I was like, okay, well, I'm in this uncomfortable middle period, but like, give me a couple decades, and then like, when I'm 80, I'll look really cute again.
So we have to. I think that we have to redefine. Like, I think we're really cute in this middle age too. I'm falling in love with my 11s just fine. So, what were some of the barriers that you kind of had to overcome throughout your career? Because we all, like, none of this happens overnight. It doesn't have, making a film about, one of our most beloved Supreme Court justices or American veteran. I have to say that one also was an eye-opening, beautiful story, again, about love. Clearly, the love, but what it meant for an American veteran to be blown up in Afghanistan and to come home and re-find life,
right?
In such an inspiring way. None of that is easy. What are some of the hurdles that you've had to overcome to tell these stories?
Yeah, I mean, the hurdles are, often, in the case of American Veteran, like getting the funding to do the story, or even not getting fully funded, but just going, I think in earlier stages, because of RBG being more of a commercial success, that sort of opened the door to more recent things being easier to get funding. Just honestly, but in, just a few years ago, the issue was really figuring out how I could do some things that did bring in an income, even while I was doing some projects that seemed really important to do, but that I understood weren't going to be big money makers, and because they're not that commercial, it's going to be a challenge to get them funded. And I just kind of chose at that point to try to split my life and my projects, to try to have do a certain amount of work that was just meant to generate some income that could help to do the projects that were kind of like more my dreams to do.
Gotcha. Can you give me some examples of because there's always that balance, and it's interesting because it's.
Oh, sure.
I find that also in my own work. So
yeah, when I left NBC, and I did it like by choice and very consciously, like I understood that I was about to go into a situation where I wasn't going to have the same stability. I'm fortunate to be married to a lovely man who has a job and has health insurance for us both. And I understand that not everyone has that same good. I mean, that's one of there's a myriad of ways in which I'm a privileged person, and that's one of them. So, but I had a job for quite a while, and that's good, and had helped me save some money. And then when I left NBC, along with the documentary stuff, I was also doing I did a lot of like public relations videos. I made a video for the Hospital for Special Surgery, like a 30-minute film about their history. It was quite interesting. It was done they commissioned me to do it. They paid me to do it. Like that's how I was making a living. I also did Sturgeon Queens because I wanted to do it, but like I was making my living doing like public relations videos, and also doing just other commissioned projects I did a lot of programs for New York PBS, that just like a half-hour project would come up, and they would ask me whether I would do it, and if I was available, I'd get paid to do that.
Julie, thank you so much for coming here today and sharing your story with our listeners who are change makers in their own right. You see, the power to dream comes from the ability to see an interest or yourself or a passion and how somebody else has carved a path for you. So I want to personally thank you, Julie, for carving that path for these future change makers. Listeners, this is my dare to you. I want you to take these revelations revealed in this episode and dare to design an inclusive and equitable future today. Designed by Dot Show is written and produced by the Design Corps at Aurora 21 Studios. Podcast producer, audio engineer, and original music by Rachel Bickley. Commercial voice talent by Angelo Giannoni. And I'm your host, Joanna Peña-Bickley.